In the age of the Internet of Things, with subscriptions and cloud services abounding, you'd be inclined to think that pretty much everybody has a decent internet connection, but that's not exactly the case. Per the FCC's last broadband deployment report, nearly 4% of Americans still lack access to a fixed internet connection with a minimum download speed of 25 megabits and an upload speed of 3. That doesn't sound like a lot, and neither does 4%. But 4% is still 13 million people. That's the same as if all of LA and New York were without internet. Kind of ridiculous to think about, isn't it? Now, most of that deficit is made up in rural areas and on tribal lands. And for the purposes of this video, I'm going to be mainly speaking from the standpoint of rural areas since, well, I live in the forest. This lack of access stems from a number of things, whether it be cost, the impracticality of getting a signal to a location a certain way, or even local governments being blocked from investing in broadband as a utility. I'm going to get back to that last part in a second. I wanted to talk about the cost thing first. In rural areas particularly, where ISPs are bound to have less subscribers, they're less inclined to lay connections this far out of the city. This means less competition out here in rural markets, driving the prices of what does make it out here up considerably. Now, that other bit that I said that I was coming back to. In 2005, thanks to lobbying from Comcast and Qwest, now CenturyLink, Colorado passed Bill SB 05-152, which was designed to exclude local governments from entering into the broadband market, and it blocked the use of county and municipality money to make any upgrades or changes to broadband infrastructure. Thankfully, over 140 municipalities in this state have decided to opt out of this bill and are making progress despite it. Part of the cost overhead, in some cases, especially in rockier mountainous areas like these, is due to just the sheer cost of laying the cable in the ground. You've got to drill and blast and all this kind of stuff, and it's a headache. A more common approach out here is to use either satellite internet or a point-to-point network. This point-to-point method relies on having a tower with a stable connection somewhere closer to an urban area with a fast connection. It then wirelessly transmits that signal to a tower on a mountain closer to the customer base that will be using it. The signal can either be repeated again using smaller dishes, or it's sent underground in more favorable places where it can be delivered directly to a home via fiber. A satellite works simply by sending a signal from one location on the globe with good internet access to a satellite that can then retransmit that signal to a number of users concurrently. Both standard satellite and these point-to-point networks have the same issue, however, which is limited bandwidth for concurrent users. The more subscribers these companies get means the less bandwidth they can offer to their customers overall. Really, this applies to all internet connections, but it's particularly apparent and noticeable on geosynchronous satellite networks and point-to-point tower-based communications. These solutions can be really costly, partially due to lack of competition, but also due to lack of adoption, as well as just the general cost of the hardware itself. I do want to talk about another type of satellite internet though, LEO constellations. Now, LEO stands for low Earth orbit. LEO constellations are clusters of satellites that move throughout the night sky much closer to Earth than the geosynchronous satellites that I mentioned earlier. With many more satellites making up the surface as a whole, it means less bandwidth overhead and more people can use it simultaneously. The promise of these constellations is huge. Broadband speeds to the entire globe with lower ping times than traditional satellite internet, a lot closer to broadband, with the only caveat being a clear view of the sky. Sort of. These faced significant controversy early on when SpaceX announced Starlink, and still face scrutiny today, especially with more companies joining the race for space-based internet. Starlink's initial rollout was fraught with a ton of issues, largely due to the amount of time it took to deploy the satellites, the global parts shortage kind of putting a stranglehold on the industry as a whole, and the effect it was having on astronomy. Astronomers the world over complained about the bright reflections these satellites created in the night sky, complicating their research. Many also feared that these satellites would be added to the growing debris cloud that encircles the Earth currently. SpaceX has made modifications to the satellites to decrease their overall brightness in the night sky, and have also been discussing their plans for deorbiting deprecated satellites, as well as a much more ambitious plan of using their new, as yet untested ship, Starship, to go and collect space debris as a whole, as effectively as like a space garbage truck. But enough about issues. What's the service actually like? Does it stack up to broadband? Is it better than our current internet? I put a deposit on Starlink around March of last year. The order didn't end up shipping until April of this year. The delay in getting our order was due to a couple of things. The parts shortage, as well as the availability of the service over Colorado being consistent. When our order did arrive, though, I was happy to find out that we did indeed receive the V2 of Dishy McFlatface. The dish itself was rather large and comes with a basic stand that, in my opinion, is more or less for just finding a decent spot where to set it up and temporarily test it out. Starlink offers a variety of mounts that allow you to set it up more or less wherever is best for you. Their Wi-Fi router is more or less just that, with no place to connect Ethernet without an adapter that's also available on the Starlink store. And while that's a little annoying, I can kind of understand it to a point. I would rather they have just kept the Ethernet port on it though. Setting it up was rather easy because they have a rather neat little utility for figuring out where's a good spot to place the dish. The configuration process overall in their app was probably the most straightforward I've ever experienced out of an internet connection. The Starlink app also has some really cool features built into it that make it amazing for troubleshooting any issues. Let's talk about speed and the importance of having a clear view of the sky. Network speeds on Starlink can vary significantly per my observance. I've observed speeds as low as 25 megabits a second and speeds as high across our whole house network of 280 megabits a second. Having a clear view of the sky is really important with Starlink because these satellites aren't stationary. This isn't like geosynchronous satellites where you can kind of just have a hole through the trees that you can aim your satellite through, and that's good enough because it'll never move. These satellites are constantly moving through the night sky just because of the way that low Earth orbit actually works. So if you have a bunch of trees like we do, you might have some interruptions every now and then. To add to that, Starlink seems to have a few issues during a heavy downpour, as I've noted a few times. This is what a fairly heavy storm looks like on the Starlink app. Other than these once-in-a-blue-moon rainstorms that come and take Starlink out for several minutes at a time, we've only ever experienced short interruptions every couple minutes that have been decreasing in their regularity as more satellites are deployed. Overall, it's been a massive improvement to our internet. While our point-to-point connection is technically more stable, it's slow. Starlink gives us the speeds to do things that our standard internet connection just kind of would take hours to do. We can actually watch videos without them buffering and live streams without them looking like potato quality. We can just download large games and it doesn't take literally days to download. The interruptions that we experience on Starlink really only ever impact things that could be done fine via our point-to-point network, things that don't actually take a lot of bandwidth, but they do need a constant connection. Things like phone calls and video conferencing. So has Starlink replaced our home internet? Well, not yet, but it has supplemented it in an incredibly impactful way. Getting the speeds that Starlink gives us off of our point-to-point network would cost us 5 times more. The availability of Starlink and connections like it from small ISPs has made me feel promise for the future of connectivity in America and globally. More competition means better prices for the end consumer and a wider array of options to suit everyone's needs. Internet is a utility. In this age, an internet connection is almost a requirement, and that was made abundantly clear during the pandemic. Households without an internet connection were stuck between a rock and a hard place when they suddenly couldn't work and couldn't go to school. The double-edged sword is that libraries were closed and restaurants simultaneously weren't allowing anybody inside, so people would sit outside to use Wi-Fi. The easier and cheaper it is for people to get online, the better it is for everyone. The point of this video is not to be a massive downer about the situation, but to shed some light on how the connectivity gap keeps shrinking. Now, do keep in mind that this is only one aspect of the digital divide. Low-cost electronics for students and families, as well as communications equipment for rural communities and tribal lands, are another thing that need to be dealt with. You can find links down below for the FCC's broadband deployment reports, as well as more information on the internet connectivity gap in the digital divide.